In the year of our Lord 2021, it's hard to ignore the fact that American civilization seems to be moving ever closer to the total state, where a central bureaucracy dictates every aspect of personal, family, religious, and professional life. But how could this have happened in a country guarded by the Constitution? A document carefully crafted around the principle of separation of powers, designed specifically to prevent the consolidation of power and the rise of tyranny. In his book, The Ruling Class, Gaetano Mosca explains that the failure of the separation of powers to prevent the emergence of an all-encompassing bureaucracy was not due to a flaw in the idea of power checking power, but in understanding what the origins of the competing powers must be. Mosca said that the major issue with Montesquieu's theory of the separation of powers actually mainly comes from the way his students chose to apply his work. When people look back at Baird and Montesquieu's work today, the things that they tend to focus on are the more formal and legalistic aspects of the theory. The three branches of government are treated like they're supposed to work as some kind of finely tuned machine, automatically checking and balancing each other once set in motion. But Mosca points out that most people who treat government mechanically fail to understand that the branches only work when they represent distinct and organic aspects of society. Mosca says, quote, "They have often forgotten that if one political institution is to be an effective curb upon the activity of another, it must represent a political force. It must, that is, be the organized expression of a social influence and a social authority that has some standing in the community, as against the forces that are expressed in the political institutions that is to be controlled. That is why, in certain parliamentary monarchies, in spite of the letter of the constitutions and the fundamental charters, we see heads of states who are supported neither by ancient traditions, nor by the all but vanishing prestige of the divine right doctrine, nor by the influence of the bureaucracy, the army, or the economically superior classes, becoming powerless to counterbalance the influence of elected assemblies, who are supported by the belief that they represent the totality of the citizens and actually compromise within themselves a considerable body of capacities, interests, ambitions, and energies." End quote. Without distinct and independent centers of influence in society, branches of government can't possibly check each other because they don't actually serve different influences. They all simply become different arms of the same master. And why do they all end up serving the same master? Mosca identifies mass democracy as the culprit. In the original U.S. Constitution, only 1/2 of the government was actually directly elected by the people, and even then with an extremely limited franchise. One had to appeal to many different interests and power bases to govern. But as the franchise expanded and the percentage of the government that was elected by the masses grew, only one skill really became necessary to maintain control: the manipulation of electoral outcomes. Instead of having to appeal to distinct interests divided among the classes and regions, all power, no matter which branch was wielding it, became dependent on the same mass popular will. And as the state absorbed larger and larger portions of the social and economic spheres in the name of fulfilling its promises to the masses, the only force to which they were now theoretically beholden, we got a very predictable result. Mosca says, quote, "There is no use either in cherishing illusions as to the practical consequences of a system in which political power and control of economic production and distribution are irrevocably delegated to or conferred upon the same persons. Insofar as the state absorbs and distributes a larger and larger portion of the public wealth, the leaders of the ruling class come to possess greater and greater facilities for influencing and commanding their subordinates, and more easily evade control by anybody. One of the most important reasons for the decline of the parliamentary system is the relatively huge number of offices, contracts for public works, and other favors of an economic character which the governing class is in a position to distribute either to individuals or to groups of persons. And the drawbacks of that system are the greater in proportion as the amount of wealth that the government or local elective bodies absorb and distribute is greater. And the harder it becomes, therefore, to secure an independent position and an honest living without relying in some respect or another upon public administration. If then all the instruments of production pass into the hands of the government, the officials who control the apportioned production become the arbiters of the fortunes and welfare of all, and we get a more powerful oligarchy, a more all-embracing racket than has ever been seen in a society of advanced civilization." End quote. To avoid this outcome, Mosca suggests that a separate, aristocratic power base inside the society is essential. Independent sources of moral authority, like the church, and independent economic and military sources of authority, like regional aristocrats, must be allowed to maintain power bases that draw influence from sources that are not part of the central bureaucracy. If you've watched some of my previous videos, you might hear echoes of Bertrand de Juvenel's theory about the centralization of power, how different spheres of influence are necessary in order to contain the state's natural desire to always expand its own sphere of influence. Because without the constant resistance that opposing social forces apply to the state, it will inevitably degenerate into an all-encompassing oligarchy, a form of government Mosca warns has brutal results. Mosca says, quote, "But when the class that monopolizes wealth and arms embodies its power in a centralized bureaucracy and an irresistible standing army, we get despotism in its worst form, namely a barbarous and primitive system of government that has the instruments of an advanced civilization at its disposal, a yoke of iron which is applied by rough and reckless hands, and which is very hard to break, since it has been steeled and tempered by practiced artisans." End quote. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and click like. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a great time to do so. If you'd like to support my work like the amazing people whose names are being shown on the screen right now, you can go ahead and follow the links below the description to my Subscribe Star. That's also where you'll find links to things like my Twitter, my Odyssey channel, and my Rumble channel if you want to follow me on any of those platforms. You can also check out the merch store in the links below. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, I'll talk to you next time.